assure you that you have chosen wisely. It's well known that this is going to be the most interesting, exciting, interactive, if not totally fascinating panel of the entire 4 days of the Internet Governance Forum. So you have chosen very, very wisely, and everyone who's not here will be jealous of the fact that you were here. Let me suggest the following as our format, and this will come as a surprise to your panelists up here, because I like this to be a surprise. What I'm going to ask our panelists to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and Sunil's going to start because he was silly, he sat at the end of the table. So we're going to go start with Sunil and work our way down. And what I want each of the panelists to do is to give us one thing that that panelist thinks is the most important fact, suggestion, idea that that panelist wants you to know when you leave here about our subject, about mobile and privacy, largely because we're going to assume that each one of you has thought, worked in, talked about the issues of privacy generally, who hasn't, mobile in particular, because it's ubiquitous. And so the object here for each of the panelists, the test that they are being given, is to give you at least one thing, but only one thing to start off with. You can weave in other ideas over the course of the next hour or so in answer to questions. But one thing that you think that these people out here, paying all this good money to sit in these seats, should know when they leave here. Once we are finished with that very brief, maybe even cryptic statement from each of our panelists, I am going to play a bit of a devil's advocate and make them slightly debate with each other over these things, if I can figure out how to do that. But that will only last a few minutes, because it seems to me that you all are probably as knowledgeable and as interested in the subject as the people sitting up here, making you get a crinked neck because you have to look this way even though your seats are at 90 degrees. So we're going to make this interactive. I will call on whoever raises their hands, ask you to give a comment, a question. The only thing I ask for you to do is to be provocative. The objective of this session, at least as I see it, is that you come away saying, I learned something. I understand something, I know something that I did not know when I came here. Otherwise, it's a wasted opportunity and we could have been taking a nap. So with that, Sunil, start us off with something provocative, short, and important that everyone should know.
I was born in a Christian family, but I was raised in a Hindu nation, so I don't really get this obsession with one God and one truth, but I will try. The privacy principle that I recently find useful when thinking about these issues is that expectations of privacy protection and guarantees of privacy protection should be inversely proportional to power. People at the bottom of the pyramid with no power should be subject to the least surveillance, and people at the top of the pyramid with the most power should be subject to most surveillance. And in India, we have a case study which demonstrates how this is possible. One of the surveillance organizations, intelligence agencies in India, the NTRO, has imported over the last 5 years around 1,300 off-the-air interception devices. Of these 1,300 interception devices, 400 have been deployed in New Delhi in and around the Parliament building. So there is a lot of surveillance happening in India at the top of the pyramid. I'm a bit conflicted about whether this really works, and this is a principle that we should all adopt and advocate for, and I hope it will provoke some debate. Thank you.
Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Juliana? One thing.
I think privacy should be a user's choice. It should be my choice as to what information I should share. And the devices and the services that I use should respect that right. I'll give you one example. I don't know if some of you got local numbers when you came here, but if you did, you may have gotten some promotional SMSs from Safaricom. It should be a choice whether you want an advertisement or not. It should default to no advertisement. Even if it's directly from Safaricom, you shouldn't have to worry about saying stop. You should be able to say start first, not say stop. So I think it should be a choice that users make and not a choice that is made for them by mobile service providers, app developers, or anybody else.
Okay, let me warn you, that didn't sound that provocative to me. So, but we'll see how we go here. Patrick, pressure's on you.
All right, David, I'll give it a shot. I wanted to just sort of propose a hypothetical of a Kenyan cloud provider that sells cloud services to enterprise customers. You know, a company that started out of a garage, not unlike Google did in several years ago, and think about this hypothetical service provider that delivers a product. Let's just say it competes with a product like Google Apps or something like a Microsoft Word and sells to enterprise customers. Now imagine that the product works very well, and consumers start using it worldwide. In the name of privacy, this application would probably not be legal for use in Europe because of the privacy rules that attach to to various different European companies. In the name of protecting consumers, they would not be able to use this product because Kenya is not an adequate country under the European Privacy Data Protection Directive. And so I just want to throw that out there in the name of many other countries like Kenya and many other developers like this hypothetical cloud operator that I just described. That sometimes these privacy laws and norms, which are very important for protecting consumers and are certainly absolutely key to an open internet, but can certainly act as barriers for many new companies to deliver new services to customers.
All right. I'm not sure how provocative that was, but we'll find out if there are some Kenyan cloud computing experts here who have found that to be a problem. Jeff, more pressure for you. Okay. Be really provocative, and I'll even give you a microphone.
Thanks, David. I don't know, it seems like we're not living up to your high standards. I guess what I would say is, a typical provocative statement may be that privacy is dead. I actually don't think that is true. I think that when we have asked our customers, they care deeply about privacy and they want control. But I think our job is more difficult than that. We can do a lot of work to think about how to provide and secure privacy in this complex mobile environment. But the reality is that's not enough for our customers. They want all of the security and privacy, but they also want all of the choice that comes from mobile services and all of the convenience, and they want to be able to share their data and manage their own data. So I think we have an incredibly challenging task in front of us, because it's not just about privacy, it's about giving consumers what they want, which is both all of the facilitating the information as well as the privacy.
All right.
Okay. Provocative, eh? Well, first of all, I suppose I struggle with two identities. I'm half Irish and half British, but I don't know which is which, and I don't know which one to present, certainly to some social networking sites. To be provocative, I think that was really interesting of Google to say that European laws prevent innovation, etc. I'd agree, but I'd also agree that mobile operators are probably more restricted than Google in that, and I think it's time to look at functional equivalent data, look at the privacy context, and regulate that context, not the infrastructure. So if I give you an example, in Europe, for example, the GPS cell ID data used by Google is not regulated, but it is when it's a mobile operator that uses that data. So that's the real challenge. How do we address that to ensure that the user has a consistent privacy experience? Because it is about the user. And I think often policymakers forget it's about the user and what it means to the users, and we need to focus more on that. That's my provocative statement.
Ian?
I'll start unprovocative, but then I'll try to move into more provocative. I think we'd all agree users demand control. That's very important for their trust in the technology, their willingness to buy products. I think thinking about how you can provide that to users, particularly with mobile apps, where, as several people have mentioned already, you might have micro businesses developing these apps from anywhere in the world, selling them then on these open global marketplaces to customers in Europe and in countries with very different privacy standards. How can we sort of give the benefits of that to consumers around the world without regulation getting in the way of innovation and all the good things we've heard about? I think platforms will play a really key role in that. I think mobile operators and companies like Google, I think they will have to help their users. If I'm using my iPhone or Android phone and I see an interesting app from a developer I don't know much about, how can I, using services from the platform, convince myself I will stay in control, that it will use data, my very sensitive data about where I am with my phone, who I've been talking to, meeting with, and so on, in a way that meets my expectations. I know many technology companies outside Europe wish the Data Protection Directive would just go away. Perhaps the provocative thing I'll say to finish is it's really not going to. If you're following the debate in Europe about the revision of the directive, which is quite far advanced now, the Commission is not saying this is getting in the way of innovation, this is upsetting our international trade partners, it's putting Europe at a disadvantage. They're saying this, whether you agree or not, I won't tell you my perspective, this is the way forward, for our partners, and Europe is not relaxing the directive one bit. Actually, Europe wants to extend the reach of the directive, make it apply to as far as possible to companies supplying services to Europeans, no matter where they are geographically.
Okay. I've got a little bit of a headache here, because what I heard from, I think, everybody, either directly or indirectly, is that users ought to be in control. From the least, we should maybe prioritize and how user ought to control. The reason this gives me a headache is I don't have a clue how you figure out what users want. Now, you could easily say, ask the user, but my experience is that if you give me a survey and you ask me, is privacy important? I don't think I've ever met anybody who said privacy is not important. In fact, privacy, when you do surveys, is almost very, very important, almost uniformly. But then I watch my 26-year-old son from the time he was younger to now. I look at myself, I look at my friends, and you have a privacy disclaimer that's written by 500 lawyers that's incredibly long that you have to agree to get to the site or to have the application. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I don't think I've ever met anybody who's actually read and understood one of those things. Because people want it, they do it. So if the users are in control, what are you talking about? Are you talking about what they say in a survey they want? Or are you talking about what they really do? Sunil?
To leave it all up to the user is something I don't agree with at all. This is the principle of caveat emptor, or buyer beware. Almost 100 years ago, when it came to thousands of years of technology, which is meat packing, we decided that we couldn't leave it up to users and that we need regulation. And I don't see why we need to leave it up to users when it comes to privacy also. I think we would all like to see more user education and more controls in the hands of users, but the state of affairs shouldn't be left up to users. There is a real need for regulation, at least in my mind.
Well, Sunil, let me push back on that, because that sounds really, really draconian to me. Meat packers, people died. They ate things that were bad, didn't know it, people died. Privacy is important, and maybe there's an occasional extraordinary case where somebody is harmed physically or otherwise. But by the fact that everyone just seems to click through these things, and by and large the world has remained intact, is this really an area where you need governmental regulation?
Let's look at m-commerce in India. According to the Reserve Bank of India, banks are supposed to use digital signatures for encryption and also digitally sign the documents that they give to their consumers. But for the last 5 years, banks have been in violation of these policies. And recently, they've been part of a study group which has come out with a public report that says that this is really not necessary. What is the impact when there is fraud? Instead of the banks being liable for fraud, ordinary citizens are liable for fraud. It might be a small change when it comes to each individual consumer, but if you take it across the Indian nation, I'm sure we're talking about millions of dollars.
Okay. Jeff, your company deals with millions and millions of customers. You're the deputy privacy officer for one of the largest companies in the world. Do you want a lot of regulation on that? Do you think what Sunil said is correct? Are people being defrauded?
Well, I guess a couple of points. First, when we asked our customers, we found they were more sophisticated than I think they're often given credit for. They understand they're somewhat negotiating when they use the internet. On the other hand, I think it's a fair point that it's not clear to a lot of consumers exactly what information is being used, and I think there is a real opportunity to improve the controls. I guess back to my original point, I don't think regulation can solve the problem of making it easier for consumers to navigate their privacy. You know, you can argue that regulation is one of the reasons why we have 50-page privacy policies. That was kind of the thinking at the time, was you better lay out every detail. So I think it may be some combination of a privacy framework, but I think ultimately the more interesting maybe discussion that we're having, you know, with the regulators and with the industry and with civil society is, can we come up with agreements on ways to create better standardization of how you're being treated as you're navigating the internet, so that you can trust, okay, if I, you know, and I think the growth of the trust marks is a great example of that. If I see indications that tell me I know what practices are behind that, then I don't have to worry each time that I'm navigating a 50-page policy. So, you know, to me, the discussion of regulation is missing a key part of how to make this usable for the user.
Pat, you just got finished doing a huge report, a whole bunch of guidelines, principles, available online. I recommend it highly if you need some sleeping, as Pat was saying, you know, the way to do it. Pat, is that the right way to go? What have you found through your studies and your work in this area?
Okay, well, some stats first to put some dimension to this. I think, look, there are 7 billion people on the planet. There are 5.8 billion mobile phones, and of those 5.8 billion, 4 billion are in the developing world. And where is policy on privacy generally set? In Europe and America. And I think the thing for me that we must wake up to is that, you know, the mobile internet, people are enmeshed in a global, complex web of relationships with entities around the world. They are immersed in multifaceted social contexts, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to understand who has access to their data, and for them to be aware of and manage their privacy and express their preference and their choice and their control. It is not about pushing the burden back on the individual at all. So if I give you some other stats, for example, in terms of mobile handsets, Android has 43% of the global market in terms of OS, and the OS players have a big role to play here in terms of ensuring that privacy is designed in and built in. Apple has 18%. Symbian, some have written it off, has 22%, and RIM has 12%. So to take Aaron's point about inverse power, I think there are power relationships here, and people can step up to the mark and do things. So in terms of what are we doing, the thing that you can take away is have confidence that the GSMA and its members, we represent 800 mobile phone operators around the world, are doing things on this. We've conducted research that shows that 92% of people care about their privacy, and they want choice, and they want control, they want preference. We have an initiative underway. I think one of the challenges that we have is that privacy in the mobile space is determined by a patchwork of geographically bound laws. But data flows are global, data flows are immediate. People's privacy interests, their expectations, their needs, their wants, they transcend these geographically bound laws. And what about Kenya? Kenya doesn't have particular data protection and privacy laws to protect privacy at all, to preserve privacy. So what do we do about that? So we have established a set of global mobile privacy principles that our members and others have agreed to that will work, and we're trying to establish a global framework. We have established privacy design guidelines for mobile application development. We're working and talking to developers and others who say to us, help us build privacy and help us give people meaningful choice. So there are a number of things that we're doing. I've thrown some things out there. The law clearly isn't adequate, and I think industry self-regulation is a good way forward.
All right, Patrick, then I'll go with Juliana. Patrick, you heard Android was invoked. Android is Google. Google also, obviously, big on the wireline side, broadband. Big on the mobile side, the focus of this seminar or workshop. You're a global company. What do you do about this? You've got, not only do you have the mobile space, which we've heard is complicated, you've got the landline space, the traditional broadband space. You operate in virtually every country in the world. How do you handle this? And where do you think needs to be done?
Well, it's true that it's true that Google has the Android operating system, and we're very proud of it. I mean, just a statistic that public statistic that we've been talking about, and we're proud of this fact. There are 550,000 new Android activations every day. That's quite a number, and it's an operating system that really is on the map. Just in the last couple of years, that really didn't have any sort of market share a few years back, and so we have obviously a growing presence in the area, and Google is increasingly recognizing its responsibility in this regard. And Google has learned from various different mistakes on privacy, right? Alan Davidson's testimony about the Android operating system just a couple of months ago before Congress, he pointed out that with the Google Buzz settlements, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with that, but there was a Google Buzz settlement. It was a consent decree, thank you, where the company agreed to have reviews by the FTC every 2 years of Google's privacy procedures. So it's something that the company takes seriously, not just because of things it has to, but also because it's been involved in in discussions with government about it. The opt-in model for location-based privacy issues is fundamental to the Android design, and we believe that users should be in control. They should be able to choose and opt in every case when they want to enable and use location-based services. There's a lot of value in location-based services for mapping. If you're out and about and you want to find out where a coffee shop is, it's convenient to be able to put the search term in and have a coffee shop be pointed out to you nearby. But that's an opt-in feature, as are the other location-based features for Google. So yes, we think it's very important, and it's an ongoing very important issue.
All right, Juliana, as our representative of Kenya on this panel, one of the things that I was really blown away to learn at the IGF, and I heard it from the minister, I heard it from the permanent secretary, both independently, so I'm sure it's right, and that is that 90% of new mobile phones being sold in Kenya are smartphones, which means, among other things, that Kenya is right there at the beginning of what we, in at least North America, talk the beginning of the hockey stick, where everyone's been talking about the fact that we're going to go from about 1.5 billion internet users. We know there's over 5 billion cell phone users in the world, mobile phone users. They're all going with smartphones. That means they're all on the internet or potentially on the internet. Things change. First of all, is that what's happening here in Kenya? Are they all going to smartphones? And if so, what impact is that having?
It is absolutely right. Just to give you a quick idea, the Ideos phone, when it came on sale here in Kenya, it quickly sold out in many of the stores. I think there was a number that about 350,000 iDEOS phones have been sold in just a matter of months. So it does show that we have this continuum of where we not only have mobile services being offered through SMS, that we also have the data component issue. What I did want to, the impact of that is, like Pat mentioned, that policy around privacy is done in the Western countries. Now, as a platform maker and one that is based in Kenya and was founded in Kenya, we really want to think about software that works for us. And in this emerging area of smartphones, we also want to think about privacy issues that matter to us. Let me give you an example. In terms of privacy issues, like I mentioned, you're not able to quickly opt out of ads from Safaricom, which, you know, I think that's an egregious travesty around your rights, because you own the device, but you cannot control the service provider's behavior towards you. I think looking at these principles, mobile service providers need to respect people's rights, and it's okay for them to see themselves as just a conduit of information. Specifically about the smartphone growth, we have a platform that is used for crowdsourcing information, and I do want to make the point that we will see emerging issues around privacy. If you look at the revolution in Egypt, you had people uploading video, and there are questions now about the privacy of the people captured in those videos, because there could be retribution. If I could just mention the work of Sam Gregory and the Witness team, they've got an application that helps blur the images on video, and it's an app that sits on the phone, but this is sort of, these are concerns. Egypt is in Africa, so these are African issues. So I think we're really in that point where, yes, it is a tipping point, but we can definitely start with that first base of respect from the mobile operators and other platform makers.
All right, Ian, one of the things that I heard Juliana talk about is developing world, different than developed world, Africa perhaps even different than other parts of the developing world. You're a researcher. You look at these things from an academic perspective. What do you find? Is everyone basically the same, or are we all very different?
You certainly find very different cultural attitudes to privacy. I don't know so much about African attitudes, but certainly visiting China, for example, there's a very different view there. At the same time, there's been quite a lot of interesting behavioral economics research done in the last few years by people like Alessandro Acquisti in the US, looking at sort of fundamental ways that people make decisions about privacy, about other issues, when they will disclose data, when they won't, what upsets them about data use. So I think that kind of more sort of fundamental human research is generalizable. I just wanted to say, to respond to a couple of points people have made. I think looking at the mobile principles that GSMA has been working on, I think a really positive thing about that is the engagement you've had with regulators, with civil society, with a whole range of stakeholders, just like the IGF, and I think that shows in the principles that you see some self-regulatory codes that are very transparently just in the interests of the industry proposing them, an attempt to sort of fend off regulation. But I think there's some very positive aspects of what you've got in there that show you're thinking about the social broader value of privacy as well as just the individual. That's an important point Sunil made, that privacy is something not just important for consumers and for individuals, it's important for democracy. It's critical to freedom of expression, freedom of association. As Juliana was saying about the events in the Middle East and North Africa, that's really emphasized that. And my final point, maybe more controversial, to stimulate discussion, is that the US, the EU governments, yes, they're thinking about privacy of their own citizens. On the sort of other side of the coin, they face serious national security challenges from serious crime online. Sometimes they have perhaps overreacted a little I would say, to that in terms of mandating data retention, in terms of telling companies you've got to store all this data about all of your customers for several years in some countries. That, of course, encourages the telcos, the other companies building these systems to build in the functionality, to build in the surveillance functionality that the European and American governments are asking for. Of course, that equipment is sold to countries like Egypt and Bahrain, and I think Western liberal democracies, so-called, should really be thinking much more carefully about the sort of spillover effects of their own surveillance policies.
Okay, Pat, you've got some numbers for us.
Well, it was just to touch on a few things that Juliana spoke about. I think in 2006 there were 7.3 million mobile phones in Kenya, and today there are 25.2 million. There are 4.7 million internet connections. 99% of those connections are mobile. So people say to me, is privacy different in mobile? Yes, it is, because you cannot translate, for example, the experiences and the consumer experience gained in a fixed desktop PC environment. You might have become familiar with how to manage your cookies on a desktop, but boy, is it a test and is it a struggle to try and manage that on a mobile phone. Not only do you have cookies and you don't have the same granularity of visibility and choice, but you have apps that collect data. You have no choice within those apps. Just to go back to a point Patrick made about Google and Android, I was very pleased in May to ask Eric Schmidt about what he was going to do about Android permissions, because Google can be very proud of the fact that it tells people what permissions an Android app wants to execute on a device. The only problem is no one can understand those permissions. So it's very difficult for people to express meaningful choice. And Eric Schmidt said that he was going to change that, and that's really a positive statement for him to make, and you know, we welcome that. I think, going back to Juliana's point, one thing that concerns me is that this is global, and we need to think about how we provide opportunities for people in Africa, in India, and elsewhere. There are app developers here who develop apps that go on an American app store, that are downloaded by citizens all around the world, and yet there is no framework to guide how privacy is built in and designed into those apps, because there's an absence of privacy frameworks, of privacy law here in Kenya. There's an absence in India. So who is determining the privacy experiences of the users of those apps? Should it just be left to the App Store? Should it be left to the OS vendor? Is it the device manufacturer? No. It's a complex, interdependent an interconnected ecosystem, and it's the responsibility of all those parties to come together to work on providing that consistent user privacy experience, because no one party can do it on their own, to be controversial.
All right, I'm going to continue to be controversial with Sunil in a moment, but let me give you all a brief warning. The warning is, after I ask my question to Sunil and after he gives an incredibly erudite answer, I'm then going to turn to you all for the next set of questions. So be prepared to make statements, ask questions to the panel, or at least make some mischief. So Sunil, representing all of the more than 1 billion people in India, what I've heard so far is that we need to be sensitive to developing world versus developed world in terms of privacy. We need to be concerned about geographic issues, perhaps Africa different than other places like South Asia. We know that India has been traditionally, particularly recently, very concerned, including the mobile environment, with regard to security, particularly with the terrible bombings in Mumbai and the use of cell phones to help precipitate that horrific event. So, in looking at all of this, and hearing you start off your one point of being difference between the least versus the most, and surveillance and the like, how different is privacy in India between the common man, perhaps, and the entrepreneur and financier in Mumbai from the rest of the world?
I don't really want to play the role of native informant and give you evidence from India which will help strengthen debates globally. But I'll tell you two stories, one from India and one from Philippines, because hopefully Indian think tanks will soon have global influence as well. The story from India is, if you get onto a train in India, as you board the train, next to the door, you will get a computer printout that has the name, age, and the seat number of all the passengers on that train. And once you board the train and sit next to somebody, questions that are considered completely normal in the Indian context is when are you going to get your daughter married, and what is your salary, and who do you work for, etc. So this is the Indian idea of privacy. My story from Philippines has a little more to do with mobile phones, which is there was research from a university, and they looked at people in the creamy classes, the upper classes, and also people at the bottom of the pyramid. And they looked at people's responses to a simple mobile phenomena, which is getting a message which says, "Can I be your friend?" And what they found is people at the bottom of the pyramid were more likely to respond positively to that message and agree to be someone's friend, because they were trying to build their reputations, occupy a position in the global attention economy, grow their social networks. But when it came to people at the top of the pyramid, they would most probably ignore that message and refuse to be somebody's friend. So there is geographical differences, but there are and temporal differences between age groups, and also class differences between, and this is the reason why I say, while we might need regulation, we're not asking for blunt regulation, we're not asking for bureaucratic regulation, we're not asking for over-regulation. What we're asking is for appropriate regulation, and hopefully a multi-stakeholder discussion like this will help us arrive at such appropriate regulation. Thank you.
Terrific, Sunil. All right, let me open it up. We have a question right here. Thank you. Please identify who you are and maybe an affiliation as you make your question. Thank you.
Sure. So my name is Chris Segoyan. I'm a researcher at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research at Indiana University. And until last year, I was the first technologist at the Federal Trade Commission in the Division of Privacy. So security is the flip side on the same coin of privacy. And in fact, to protect consumers' privacy, we need to make sure that they have secure mobile platforms. And so I actually have a question for the gentleman from the GSMA and for Google. I know, it's tough. So, yeah. So the security situation on mobile, to be frank, is horrible. So many of us used to desktop computing are used to Patch Tuesday for Microsoft. The first Tuesday, I think it's the first or second Tuesday of every month, Microsoft rolls out security patches. If you're a Mac user, you will routinely receive security updates. And in fact, Google has set the gold standard in the web space. The Chrome browser automatically updates users without users having to go out and find the updates. Your Chrome browser is always running the latest version of the browser. When was the last time you were asked if you wanted an update on your mobile phone? Never. It's very, very rare. And the reason, I'll tell you why, is that Google, except in rare circumstances, does not have the ability to push out updates to users. So you have the operating system vendor, you have the handset manufacturer, and then ultimately you have the carrier. And in many countries, it's the carriers that push out security updates. So Google will find a flaw, Google will discover or have a flaw reported. Google's engineers will fix the flaw. They will push out an update into the source code. The handset manufacturer will have to get that update and modify it for whatever chips are in that particular handset. They'll send that out to the wireless carriers, who will then modify it to either remove the ability to tether or preload their special games or whatever they're doing to customize their handsets. And in a best case scenario, this can take 6 months. And so most mobile users today are running software on their phones that is vulnerable to security flaws. Anyone in this room who's browsing the web from a smartphone can easily have their device compromised if they visit a malicious website. And this is not the case on the desktop. And this is a serious problem, because these devices have access to our most private data, our emails, photos that we may consider to be sensitive, as Scarlett Johansson recently found out. We do not have a solution to this problem. My personal belief is that, and I'll wrap this up, my personal belief is that the cause here is that wireless carriers do not think of themselves as software or hardware companies. For years, they sold devices that, they gave it to you on day one, and then you got a new one 2 years later, and they didn't want to be in the business of providing regular updates to consumers. But now we are dependent on those companies that are operating in old business models to provide us with security updates, and they are not doing it. And so it's shameful that this Android phone is running software that's 6 months out of date when Pat's Chromebook is running the most up-to-date software, and my Chrome browser is running the most up-to-date software. But this is vulnerable. Thank you.
Okay, so first we're going to go to Pat to defend the entire industry. Then we're going to go to Patrick to, I didn't sound like a lot of defense needed. You just need to defend the mobile part of Google. And I heard a vicious attack on a carrier, so we're going to have Jeff on from AT&T defend the specific carriers, particularly since I'm sure he was using AT&T back in DC.
Okay, well, Chris, hi. You didn't answer my tweet because you tweeted on this, and I tweeted you back maybe about a month ago, and I said, and I think I used the iPhone as an example, as to do you believe it's the carrier's responsibility? Because actually, I hook this up to my laptop here, my Mac, and I download the software from Apple directly. So in that situation, I'd be keen to understand what you think the role of the carrier is. But I used to also work for a carrier in the UK, and we regularly push them out. I mean, I'm quite happy to talk to you offline if you've got specific examples, because we do have, even in the GSMA, we have a security group that looks at these issues and that tries to work with multi-stakeholders to try and fix these problems, particularly on some platforms where you're correct. There are malware stealing apps that want to access various data. I think in the UK you'll see a change because one of the regulators just got in the act because there's an app that people were downloading that would help them conserve their battery power. What the app was doing was then sending premium rate SMS text messages. So that's a challenge. So people are, I mean, I'm happy to talk to you offline about that, but I'm curious what you think about the iPhone one.
Just a quick response, which is that Apple has leverage that no other company has. Right? So when the iPhone first launched in the US, they were able to extract a revenue sharing deal from AT&T that no other handset vendor had. And so Apple rolls out updates to its users, but very few of the Android phones, it's only the Nexus series where Google controls the updates. The rest, it's the wireless vendors that ultimately have the ability to push out updates or lock down or block tethering or doing other things.
That sounds like he was throwing down the gauntlet to you, Patrick.
Right. So, well, Chris, thank you for the relative softball. I know you throw some hardballs sometimes. And in this particular case, you've really helped me out by asking and answering the question. I'm going to add on a little bit to the answer because I think this is an area, that's ripe for discussion. There's room for improvement in many cases. One of the, interesting things about the iPhone is that there is just one iPhone at any given time, essentially, maybe two. But that simplifies the ecosystem considerably, right? Because Apple controls it, as you mentioned. It's a relatively closed system and one that, you have to deal with one, software, one device at any given time. Although, think back, a couple years ago, for those of you that maybe have had the first iPhone and, get a little bit frustrated with the updates, and there was, what we sort of referred to informally in industry as the iBrick update, right? Because it would, would download the software and suddenly your iPhone would slow down and it would, have these, it just seemed like it was, just operated very, very differently. So, even Apple is learning, and I'm sure improving as well. But the Android ecosystem is a complicated one. There are 170 different Android devices, right? Compare that to the iPhone or the handful of iPhones that have been developed and put to the market. That really does complicate things. There's 27 different manufacturers of those devices. Collaboration among all of these groups is a responsibility that Google certainly takes part in, as do the carriers, and we're working very closely with our carrier partners and with the device manufacturers in order to improve the user experience. But there's work to be done, absolutely.
There are thousands of PC manufacturers, and there are thousands of PCs out there that Microsoft still manages to push out updates every month.
All right, Jeff. Yeah. What's the role of the carrier in this?
I don't have the technical answer to what you're saying, whether we're making a business decision or or whether there really are issues. But I do agree with the point about Apple is, the leverage that in the relationships between us and the manufacturers, it may be unique with Apple, but I think there are a range of dynamics here. To your broader point about pushing out updates, it's interesting that you brought this up because I've heard our chief security officer actually say he thinks the wireline network could be much improved in doing this, and that it's actually a very clunky, slow process to push out on the wireline. And so he was endorsing your idea that we need to get better at pushing out updates. software flaws are too recurring and not getting addressed enough. And we've been trying to develop some network-based security for mobile phones, things that are not really possible in the way that the wireline world grew up, to try and help provide an extra layer of security in the network to help do what you're talking about, which is let's not make them, either let's not create new issues, but let's also try and improve on what is, certainly a challenging security situation on the wireline side. So.
All right. Anybody else up here want to comment before we go to the next question? Next question.
I just wanted to add one last comment. This is Mark Crandall from Google. It seems like the issue here is potentially, and I'm not necessarily speaking for Google, but it seems like the issue here is decoupling security updates that are provided to cell phones as opposed to feature updates or feature restrictions that are imposed by carriers for their own business reasons. Does that sound like a boiling down of the issues? Yeah, okay, that's just wondering.
Hi, my name's Sam Gregory and I work at Witness. It's a human rights group that uses video. Thank you, Juliana, actually, for the earlier reference. And I want to expand on the scenario that Juliana presented about the need for consideration of mobile video as we start to think about privacy issues. We've been thinking a lot about questions of visual privacy and visual anonymity, because increasingly the people who create human rights video do it on mobile devices. They don't go to a desktop computer then to edit it or share it. They directly upload. And you're getting a set of issues, and this is in the human rights scenario, of two sets of data and a visual image. Obviously the underlying EXIF or metadata that can be very compromising, as well as literally the physical image of someone, for example, who speaks out in Syria. And this is happening right now. And we've been working on some tool solutions. So Juliana mentioned the secure smart cam, which anonymizes on a phone. But that's a solution coming from a small nonprofit. What we really want to see is how the OS, the hardware, the apps, and potentially the carriers address this, as you think of video increasingly becoming the dominant mode of communication and mostly being created on mobile devices and shared via mobile networks.
Anybody want to cut? Sunil, do you have a view on what he said? Nope. I'm also a small NGO. Yeah, okay, right. Go ahead, Julia. Since he was complimenting you before, you should at least return the compliment. Right?
Okay. I would actually like Pat to address this, if he could, because he's sort of our link to the many mobile operators. And I'm just going to throw down the idea, well, we saw what Vodafone did in Egypt, where they shut off the internet. And I think mobile phone access was also interrupted at some points in time. So it does bring out the issue of at what point, when you have a mobile operator with all this information, location data, EXIF information that's been uploaded from a phone, or all this data that's flowing through their network, what sort of responsibility do they have to protect the privacy of the people who are using their networks? Or at least working with organizations such as like SAMS to perhaps provide end-to-end protection, because you can only do so much on the mobile device. In fact, encryption and decryption technology is woefully lacking. You have to be a thorough geek to get encryption working, SMS encryption working on a Nokia phone. So I'd just like to sort of add to his question, and to also add something that stuck with me, and I'd like to leave that with the attendees here. And this is something that Jan Chip Chase talked about, and he said that poor people, or the people at the bottom of the pyramid, can least afford badly designed devices, and I would add services, because mobile services, the work that AT&T does, all these things, these are services that people depend on every single day.
All right, Pat, over to you.
Okay, I'll try. Chris, I understand the issues. I mean, I've given evidence in terrorist trials and kidnappings and paedophile cases, and I've had to go to court, so I understand the need to protect witness anonymity, etc. I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation with you and understand more about that. I'd like to use the UK as an example, if I may, Julian, in responding to you. I think it's important that people understand that not only do mobile operators have privacy laws to comply with, but unlike other communications providers that are not regulated as much as mobile operators, they have license conditions imposed on them or other communications regulation. So in the UK, for example, mobile operators there have a legal obligation to maintain a capability to intercept communications. They have a legal obligation to remove any encryption they put around communications. It's law. They have no choice. But actually, that law in the UK, it's called the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, has been designed to be compliant and be compatible with ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights. And that came about because there was a real need to do that. It also regulates the communications data that a law enforcement agency or the security services can request of them. But to take one other point that Juliana raised about cutting off networks, I think it's also important to understand that in some countries, governments do have the ability to ask communications service providers to do certain things. And sometimes operators are under an obligation. They're between a rock and a hard place. But what I would say is that it needs a very clear legal framework established in this area, so that people they can be aware of their legitimate expectations to privacy generally. So if they commit a crime, what's going to happen in relation to access to that data, intercepting communications? That's the basis that RIPA is established on, and I think it works very well. But operators are in a very difficult position. Yeah.
I just wanted to address your security point. I mean, I'm not a technologist for the company, but when you're talking about applications riding on top of the network, we don't control those. And so I think part of the issue is, and there are good reasons for that, right? I mean, there are also policy considerations about the openness of the networks and the ability to easily provide applications and devices. Well, one of the trade-offs of that is you don't have one place to go to say, why aren't you encrypting the facial recognition service? Because I'm not aware that we offer such a service, so that would be someone else. And I think that's one of the challenges here, but it's also a challenge for law enforcement. I think they would love to be able to just come to us and get all the data, and they're not happy that in this complicated world that we live in now, that they are trying to keep up and figure out, how do I get access to data? I mean, then there's the question of a legitimate government request versus an illegitimate government request. But even assuming say going after a terrorist, it's a real challenge for law enforcement now because there is no one-stop place to go.
All right. Next question from David. Make sure you give your name and your affiliation. But if you can, I'm hoping that your question will bring us more on the privacy side as where the security, recognizing they're two sides of the same coin. But I'm trying to keep true to the title of our panel. Because we are being transcribed and billions of people around the world are listening carefully to what you say.
No pressure there then. Yeah, I just really, it's very interesting because there's been a number of panels at this event where youngsters have been talking about notions of privacy and of friends and so on, and it became very clear to me in a number of sessions that actually their perception of what privacy is, or indeed friends, is changing. And the provocative statement I would make to the panel, which I'd be intrigued to get an answer on, is, do you think the notion of privacy will need to change? Do you think their perception of privacy and of what friends are and what of privacy is in their life will change in a few generations' time?
I guess, all right. I think it will change. However, it does bring up an issue of, I've actually had the pleasure of meeting Stephen Balcom of Family Online Safety Institute. And the problem now is, I think there's this phrase that people forget, but if you post something on the internet, it's forever. Now, that is something that I think the young people have to understand, because there are law enforcement agencies on Facebook. There are hiring managers on Facebook who will check out your Facebook profile before you get hired. These are issues that they do not realize, that by relinquishing some of that they have to be the guardians of their privacy, and the choices that they make may influence their future. So it's definitely a valid point, and it will change. And I think probably it's a generational issue. Maybe as we progress, there'll be an HR manager who will see your drunken photos and think, hey, no big deal, you know? But for now, I think that is something to flag for the young people, because the hiring managers, when they see your drunken photos, they're going to say, well, I'm not really sure I want to hire that person. They're probably going to drink at the job. Yeah, so I think it will shift, but for now, there are some things that we do absolutely have to flag for young people.
There's some interesting research by Dana Boyd and Alice Marwick, which looks at this, and you often hear people say, not at this panel discussion, oh, young people don't care about privacy. Look at how they behave on Facebook. Privacy will be dead in a generation. Why are policymakers concerned about this thing? Actually, talking to young people, they do see social networking sites as a private space. They see it as a place to share information with their friends. They're aware that Facebook and other social networking sites can access that data, but as Juliana said, they're not, they're growing up, they're teenagers by and large, or even younger. They're not yet quite so savvy as hopefully adults are about the potential consequences of the party photo, or maybe later in life. Insurers are on Facebook as well. Insurers would be very interested to know things that might impact on whether they'll give you a loan or insurance that's necessary for a loan or a mortgage, or some other very significant potential harms. This comes back to the question, where is the harm in privacy violation? These can be things that can really damage people's lives.
I think, David, yes, the concept of privacy has to change. It's not static, it's dynamic and it's contextual, ever more so in a mobile environment. People's privacy expectations change at different courses in a relationship with an entity and use of an app. And I think young people, I think their perceptions of privacy will change. We need to educate and work and educate young people more, as we do grown-ups as well. I think, for example, location privacy. Would a young person or an adult here in this room understand what location privacy means? Is it the fact that, is location just your country? Location these days, it's where you've been, it's where you are. More importantly, it's where you are not. Which can be determined by analysing. It's where you're heading. Most mobile phones now have a compass in them. They know the direction you're pointing. They know, and you can use accelerometers to determine how far you're away from the interactive billboard, for example. Soon, when the handsets are sensor-enabled and urban environments are sensor-enabled, they'll know which floor of the shopping centre you're in. Oh, he's heading this way, get that ad ready, let's deliver. So there are things, and I think it's a challenge, particularly on the limitations of a smartphone with the small screens, etc., to help people become aware of the privacy implications. And I think, for example, we focus too much on the concept of privacy as identifiability. You don't need to know that it's Pat Walsh for a particular situation to have privacy consequences and implications for me. So how do you develop a framework? How do you develop the technology? How do you develop the rules to allow people to control privacy in context?
We have a question down here.
Thanks. My name is Rainer Stenzel from the German government, from the Ministry of Interior. And I would like to make some distinction first, talking about privacy. I think we have to build some categories if we talk about it. The first category is if we talk about the relation of a private person to a state authority, like a law enforcement agency. The second category is if we talk about a private person in the relation to a big company like Google or Apple or whoever. And the third one is if we talk about the relation of one private person or user to another user. For example, if someone is writing something or posting someone on Facebook about a third person, that might also be a problem of privacy. So I will focus on the second group, the relation of a private person to a bigger company. And I wonder whether our privacy law as we see it or as we have it, especially in the European Union, is still able to deal with the problem we have there. because one of the big pillars of our privacy law is that we are focusing on each data or setting of data. That is one problem. The second one is, well, one of the one possibility or to process data is to get the prior consent of the user. So if I download an app, what is it? Is it a consent in the whole app, or is it a consent in whatever? So these are two problems, and I wonder whether we can find a solution within the framework we already have, especially for the mobile environment. And I think it might be worthwhile to think about other solutions to ensure privacy. One example might be to think about the competition law. Why don't we think about ensuring that companies like Apple or others, Google, that they design their apps privacy friendly, and that we give it to the market and say, okay, one competitor can control the other one if this is really a privacy friendly setting and app or not. So I think we have to think about very creatively think about new solutions, how we can protect privacy, instead of just talking about do we need more or less privacy, because the privacy law as we have it might work especially for the relation of a private person and state authorities. But I doubt whether it still works even in the mobile environment within these other categories.
I think the competition idea is a good one, and it's certainly something the European Commission is talking about mandating interoperability between, certainly portability of services, which Google has done a lot on already. I think the way to take that further, to really bring competition into some of these areas, would be to say, if you're a dominant player, say like Facebook, then you should have to interoperate with other social networking sites. So I can take not just take my profile from Facebook to a competitor if I prefer the competitor's privacy policy, but if my friends are still on Facebook, I need to be able to interoperate with them. Otherwise, it's a meaningless option. You know, I can take my profile over to this service, but all my friends are over here. So I think that's something Viviane Reding has talked about in the revision of the directive. So I'll be very interested to see where that goes.
Patrick?
Sure. I'll comment briefly. I mean, this is the first I've heard that proposal. I think it's a very interesting one. I don't know that it. Yeah, it strikes me that there would be some competition issues with that, about being able to influence, competitors. Although I certainly like the idea. Something I use with my two girls, for example, when when it's time to cut a piece of cake, right? I implement the rule where one person cuts the cake and the other one gets to choose. It certainly stimulates fair cutting. At the same time, I would suggest that there is a very robust competitive market right now in privacy, and companies like Google and Facebook are competing on those fronts. The Google Plus model is an example of that. The ability to choose circles and to be able to have more granularity in that selection is something that's influencing now how Facebook is reacting to its customers, and they're rolling out different features for their customers as well. And so there is, I think, quite a bit of competition there, and I know that from Google's perspective, we look very closely at what competitors are doing, and and they're very interested in new developments in privacy.
Pat first, and then Jeff.
Yeah, well, Germany is a particularly challenging environment to do business in from a privacy perspective. I mean, if I take location privacy, for example, I think the way that privacy law has been implemented in Germany denies consumers services. So if you're a mobile operator, the rules are so tough, getting written consent so if you want to locate me, the operator would have to get consent. What does that mean? And actually that creates privacy problems because you're creating a database on third parties. So it's not worth a mobile operator getting into that market because the barriers are so high. But GPS, wireless LAN data, is not regulated. So there aren't those same barriers, so they flourish, those services. So that's one thing I'd say, that we need to be careful in privacy law, that the challenge we have in Europe is that you have a directive or two directives that have been implemented in 27 different ways, and it's a nightmare for businesses in Europe. I'm glad to see that Viviane Reding is considering all of this. In relation to the review of that framework, Vivian Redding is intent on putting in a principle of accountability. She's intent on putting in a principle of privacy by design. But then, from what I gather, they're not going to prescribe the detail of privacy by design, because recognizing that technology will always outstrip the ability of law to provide a privacy protective framework. But on your issue about the app stores and the platforms, we have had now, since April, a document out for public consultation, privacy design guidelines for mobile application development, that people in this room and others can still contribute to. And when we talk to people around the world, they're very happy to see those, because it puts in place the kind of standard, the baseline standard that you are calling for.
I was just going to respond to it. To me, competition law seems like a somewhat indirect way to go at the core privacy issue, although I think data portability is in and of itself an important value. But I guess I still go back to the point that what we really want to do is to encourage the user to have good information and easier signals about Facebook versus Google and what's happening with my data and my privacy. And so I'd say kind of horizontally as well as vertically, okay, now what happens when I download an app, on my Apple iPhone? And to me, that inherently is, there can be a regulatory framework and a baseline for it, but it's going to have to be more positive development of standards and signals to the user than I think regulation can deal with directly.
Thank you. We have a question in the back, and if you could get to a microphone, thank you.
Hi, my name is Amr and I come from Cairo. Just to compare Germany, I need you to know I walk into a Vodafone shop and I have a Vodafone number from Cairo, and when I get in a queue to pay the bill or to speak with the agent, I get an SMS telling me, welcome to your local downtown Cairo Vodafone shop. So does that, do I feel that is a violation? Yes, and I live in Africa, I live in the global south. On 25th of May, 25th of January, when on the first night we occupied Tahrir, for a couple of hours I was the only person who was capable to tweet from Tahrir, and that's only because back then I had a Nokia N900 running Tor, so I could actually, using MIMO, and I could circumvent the blocking on Twitter while there was still mobile internet and service. Those days we all chose, 12 million of us chose to break laws, the telecoms did not. And the question now is, why do telecom companies choose to go by the easier jurisdiction? Those are international companies. They are based, in the case of Vodafone, in Europe, but also in the other mobile operator, also in Europe. Why do they choose to side with the easiest jurisdiction when it comes to privacy?
I was just going to say,
answer that.
I think there are difficult decisions we have to make as companies about whether to operate in a market, but I know we've had situations where when you have the government making requests, you have local employees in that market, and we actually had a call center in Egypt that we evacuated when things happened. And so I hear what you're saying, but it's difficult for a company to make decisions about the lives of its employees in that location as well. So I'm sympathetic, and I think it's a challenging issue, but I also think there are countervailing interests when you have employees on the ground in a country.
And speaking about employees in the country, I'm going to turn to Patrick. It seems to me, in terms of that, you had a problem in China, having to do not so much with the mobile side, but variety, and yet you have a lot of employees in China who were at risk. I know from comments that Larry and Sergey made, and Eric as well, a great concern about their safety as you had legal issues with the Chinese government. You have, I think, if I remember correctly, still a couple of executives who can't go to Italy for fear of arrest because of a problem with YouTube, if I remember correctly. How do you deal with it from a Google perspective? Is this just a question of international companies being cowards?
Well, thank you for that softball.
Right. That's what I'm paid for.
So right, and these are two obviously very, very important issues, very sensitive ones. I have to say, and this isn't just a I'm not just trying to get out of answering the question, but I am fairly new to the company. I've only been here for 8 months, and a lot of those things predated me. The issue in Italy is still ongoing, and so that's a legal issue that's very difficult for me to comment on. But boy, I can tell you that Google takes takes these things very seriously, and we recognize the responsibility to our employees and also to the to the users of YouTube and to the people that are using these services. That may sound like a little bit of a non-answer, and it intentionally is so.
All right, Pat, you thought you escaped this question. You represent the entire industry.
Well, I don't know that I can speak for Vodafone, but if I understood the question correctly, it was why also a mobile operator that's international would adopt local rules. I think the initiative that I spoke about, the Mobile Privacy Initiative that the GSMA has launched with its members, seeks to put in place a global framework with consistent privacy standards and consistent experiences for users. But I think we should remember that they will always have local law to comply with, whether that is data protection and privacy law, or whether it's local interception law, whether it's local laws in relation to the retention of data. So it's very complex, but they are at least grappling with that situation, and they are coming together to put in place an overarching set of principles to give you baseline privacy protections. That's all I can say.
Any of the other Juliana wants to get into the middle of all these legal issues.
I would like to sort of ask again, sorry. I don't know if you've heard of Barlow's Internet Manifesto. J.P. Barlow, and he's a paragon and a legend in internet matters. I would just encourage the GSMA Association to think of sort of like a mobile manifesto, and think of the issues, because as he pointed out, not only was there an issue of internet services being shut down at some point, but there was an issue of blockage. So because he had Tor, which is a circumvention tool, he was able to still get to the channel that he needed for self-expression. So I would just like to sort of flag that for Pat, that you as you talk to the other mobile operators, to take inspiration from J.P. Barlow and think of a mobile manifesto that protects the right to users to express and to communicate, because we really greatly depend on mobile services. It's part of our lives, and I think that needs to be taken very, very seriously.
Let me just comment for those who may not know who she's referring to. Barlow is one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and then also, perhaps in my mind, more importantly, an occasional lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He is someone who wrote a manifesto in 1998, which is, I believe, the one she's referring to, that was a reaction to the telecoms law that was passed in the United States, in which he declared famously that no government has jurisdiction over people using the internet, which is a quaint concept today in light of all the things we've been discussing today. Sunil?
Some companies do push back, like Reliance in Motion and India. For the last 4 years, the Indian government has been asking Reliance in Motion to place the NOC within the Indian jurisdiction, and therefore they would come under the Indian ISP license, and then real-time surveillance equipment would have to be installed inside the NOC. But they have refused for 4 years now. So some companies do stand up for users. And
Amir, go ahead.
And other companies also make a conscious decision to interpret what is the situation that allows them to hand over their entire network to the government to administer in a case of national security, which was not the case in Egypt. So actually, even looking at a narrow definition of what is national security, those companies did not have the obligation to allow the authorities to administer the networks.
I believe we have an online participant. One of the billions who are listening in has decided to participate. Giannis?
Indeed, we have got a caller from Germany, Mr. Hallinen, who thinks that most of the issues discussed today focus on data protection and not privacy. So she wants the panelists to share their views as to the distinction of those two sort of notions, data protection and privacy, particularly as in the EU they constitute separate fundamental rights.
Okay, who's brave up here? When in doubt, always go to the academic. Ian, you must understand that question.
Yes, it is an interesting question. I could bore you for hours now, but I won't, I promise. In the European framework, one of the interesting consequences of that distinction between privacy and data protection is that the European Court of Human Rights often will go further, perhaps, than the EU's legal system in telling governments, you just can't do that. That just, even for very serious national security, serious crime purposes. For example, in the UK, there was a case just a couple of years ago called Essen Marper, where previously the UK government had been keeping DNA samples from everybody who was arrested for everything except the most minor crime in the UK. So they were up to about 5 million people's samples on this database. You know, they had some very good reasons for doing so, for catching rapists. You know, there were many very serious crimes had been solved using that technology. At the same time, the court said this goes too far, keeping this data on everyone that's arrested, not just people that have been convicted. So a lot of people that are arrested are not convicted, and they should be treated as innocent until proven guilty. The court said that just goes too far. And the relevance of this to mobile privacy and internet policy is it takes a long time for those kind of cases to filter through the European legal sort of framework all the way up to this European Court of Human Rights. And I think when issues of data retention, of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act and equivalents in many European countries that do give a lot of power to law enforcement and intelligence agencies to access data about people's internet use, reach these courts, I would not be surprised if they come to some of the same conclusions, to say, look, okay, these laws do set out relatively clearly when these powers can be used, so people can understand what's going on, but in a democratic society, they just go too far.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, next question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Fawad Bajwa from Pakistan. Well, in the immediate short term, within the immediate short term, how is, like, this goes to like everyone, from government, private sector, to the civil perspective. Within the immediate short term, let's say 12 months, how does each of you see, and to what level or to what extent are you going to address these issues that you've discussed? And how much what do you think is the success factor? I come from a country where there's no consultation on this, and when they're taking over, you know who I'm talking about, they just come with axes, and they just chop down the optical fibers and whatnot to the towers. That easy for them. So then no regulation, nothing plays over here. It's just communication has to be shut down so that no one knows it's happening. And the next day you find out that, like, you know, what happened. So in the immediate, like, the manifesto idea is also something which says, what are you going to do in the short term to address this? Obviously, there's no one solution fits all, but there should be sort of a global move towards it, at least, you know, sort of a GSMA becomes the central point for that information. But still, what is the shortest term thing you can achieve with regards to privacy and these issues we discussed? Thank you.
All right, I think we will turn first to Pat, because you've just spent a lot of time working on a very important set of principles and policy suggestions. How does that fit into it? How do you see this being implemented? What sort of time frames are we talking about, and how important is it?
Okay, so yes, we have our initiative, which is looking at establishing baseline principles. We have operators who operate in Pakistan who are committing also to doing this. In terms of timescales, I can't give an absolute timescale at the moment. We're still working out some of the ideas. So in October, for example, we have a workshop where we're bringing people together to discuss, is it possible to have privacy icons on a device? Because in many places in the world, people can't read and write. So we have to communicate things in a very clear, simple way. specific to the device. We have the workshop looking at concepts of privacy nudges. So Carnegie Mellon University in the US, for example, doing a lot of work on how you can make people aware in context, in particular social context, of a need to make a decision. So we're bringing them over and other academics in October in London to discuss how we can do and translate some of these words into meaningful actions. So we are doing things. Yeah.
Jeff, of course, wants to say something, which means I need to move the microphone
I'd just
again.
like to have you move it
This is
back.
my exercise regime.
I was just going to by the gentleman from Germany. I think the way you frame the issues of, it's very different issues dealing with government versus big companies and privacy. And I think Pat was talking about one aspect of it, but I also think I was on a panel earlier today where we were talking about the need for clear process rules that governments would follow when there is an emergency or a legitimate security situation versus an overreaction. And then obviously you have a challenge when you have governments that are just repressive. And I think, so that to me is translating overall principles down to more specific guidelines. And as we were talking about before this discussion, you have to have a discussion with governments before the emergency or the urgent situation happens. And I think even in developed countries, as we've seen this summer, that discussion needs to happen. And we need to find ways to establish some better processes for dealing with these issues. And then, as you said, we have to have a global discussion with the countries where we really have challenges. Yeah.
We have a question over here.
My name is Francis Owino, project manager, SEPTE Kenya. I request the panel to allow me to give a slight comment. It's actually a comment. I think, ladies and gentlemen, let us give credit to where it deserves. I'm a Kenyan originally. Basically, I've seen what the Googles and the Twitters have done. They've done a commendable job. You've made accessibility to internet globally, and it's really amazing. What I've seen, if I can take back to the world where we are back, it was so difficult to accessibility. But you've simplified innovation, and it's credible. And I just want to say you've done a good job, and keep it up. Thank you.
Well, we should end this panel immediately, it seems to me at that point. How can you get any better than that? You guys have changed the world. Any last questions or comments? We're going to end with an FTC
So I have a question for Jeff from AT&T. So yesterday, Wired News had a story based on a document from the Department of Justice that the ACLU had obtained via FOIA that compared the data retention practices of U.S. wireless carriers. And that document noted that AT&T keeps cell tower location data forever. So starting in 2008, you guys have been keeping cell tower data indefinitely. And this is not something that a consumer would learn by reading your privacy policy. This is not something that a consumer would learn by navigating your website. And so this isn't a matter of whether the icon is sufficiently understandable or whether the privacy policy has been written by lawyers or whether it's 50 pages or 1 page. You are not disclosing the privacy practices that matter. And so a two-part question. One is, why are you retaining cell tower location data indefinitely? And two, why are you not telling your customers about this?
Chris, I saw the article, but I don't have the detailed explanation. But I think we obviously need to know why we're keeping the data, how long, and really is this accurate? And I don't have that information right now. I saw the article, but to your broader point, I think we do feel like we need to be clear with our customers, both in terms of how we're using the data and what we're using it for, and we do try and do that in our privacy policy. And I think the other point that goes to this issue is we need clear standards for what law enforcement can get access to, and what that threshold should be as well.
Your privacy policy doesn't mention the word retention at all. There's no number of months or days listed in there. I mean, if the DOJ document is wrong and you're in fact only keeping it for a year, that's great. But you don't disclose that you're keeping it for a year. You disclose nothing.
Right, and I think that's, as far as I know, that is not standard practice with any company to disclose at that level of detail, and that's maybe something we need to have a further discussion about.
Okay, our time is up, but I'm going to let, in the tradition I tried to establish at the beginning of this fun workshop. One last thing that you want people to know before they leave and rush for the doors that you think is important that they probably don't already know. And I'm going to start with Ian on this side. Oh, we have more questions, more questions. All right,
okay.
No more first things. We'll go with the audience.
Good evening. Okay, I'm Maxwell. I represent one of the public universities in Kenya. I'd like to talk about what Juliana said about the young people and the social network. Growing up as a young man, it's quite challenging. You will find that guys, they are frustrated with life, and so they would like to maybe release this frustration to the social networks without knowing that whatever you put on that network, it will come back to haunt you. Like once Pat's boss, Larry Page, said that whatever you put on the network, it may come back to haunt you. So I think what we need to do, maybe we need to narrow down to the institution so that they can be taught maybe about the privacy issues when they're doing, maybe the guys doing computer science, BSc IT, software engineering, so that they get to know that this network is quite good when doing certain things, but whatever you upload on that site, know that even your kids, your grandchildren, one day may get to know, so when Dad was in campus was a drunkard, and here he's telling us we should behave or we should not drink alcohol. So we need to look on those issues. Thank you.
Pat, you look anxious to talk about drinking.
No, I spoke with a really clever developer who proposed something in social networking and about the fact that people really understand what they're doing when they post. And I'm conscious that Richard's here for Facebook, so this is not a bad, this is nothing, no criticism. This guy suggested that, hey, you have this pop-up saying, do you realize your mum can see this? And people would make a very different decision about what it is they're going to post if they could realize the context and the implications. And it's how do you help people like that? I mean, take my son's 9.5. When he was 8, he's on Club Penguin, which is a little thing for kids to get together and pretend they're penguins. And you need, it's a little social networking thing, and but you need parental consent. So you have to sign up. The email goes to the parent, right? And you press, yes, I agree. So he and his little friend, when they were 8 years old, I caught them discussing, well, let's just go into Hotmail and set up an email, and we could just click OK. So I think for young people, education is really important to help people understand this area, I think.
I'm going to exercise the extraordinary powers given to the moderator at these sessions by noting the fact that our time is well up. I invite everyone to approach any of the panelists, perhaps with the exception of me, with your further questions. And with that, I think we should appreciate in the standard and typical way our panelists.